We're here.
We're here.
I like how we've developed a little rhythm there. I like this.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. Cillian Kieran, the CEO of Ethica, which is privacy tech, one of the smartest people I've met. Met him through
Tremendous business person.
A friend of mine, and super cool thinker.
Yeah, no, and like he's on his second business, no?
2 or 3,
2 or 3.
Yeah.
I love guys who drop out of college and just do cool shit. Like they have a courage I don't have. Like it's just like guys and gals who just like they're like, you know what? I'm not gonna go down this road that all the rest of you guys are traveling. I'm gonna find my own trail and build it. I love that.
It's amazing. Amazing that he did that. Amazing that he transitioned from being a developer to a founder CEO. That journey in itself too, and to take on privacy. He likes to downgrade his privacy knowledge, but it's just as good as anybody we talk to on this show. He's as deep as anybody on that stuff, and he's building great tech for developers, privacy engineers in particular. But I think they're solving a lot of really complex problems. And
I think you're hitting it on the head, which is like, I know privacy is in vogue and everybody's trying to figure out how to make money, but like the problems are not easy. It's not like, it's not like you can build a little widget that does flips and now you've got $1 billion business. Like this is hard. You got to get it right. There's a lot of risk and there's a lot of selling that is involved. Like it's hard to demonstrate value in this space, not in the sense of that people aren't worried about privacy, but that in the sense that whatever you're selling actually drives a privacy goal of some kind, right? Which helps enable the business. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And you alluded to in our discussion with him that like the legacy systems that they're designing privacy tech to help, like it's going to be difficult because they were designed with different parameters, and now it's so not a simple problem. And you have to balance, like that company thinks they built their system just fine, and
that's right, and they did. It's just not fine today, and like that's exactly.
Well, here it is. This is a great conversation.
Let's do it.
Here we are.
We're here.
Data Protection Breakfast Club. Cillian Kieran, who's the CEO of Ethica. He's got a sick background behind him. I can't wait to talk about Back to the Future and data privacy.
Easily the nicest background I've seen this whole series. So very nicely done. Your name makes me think of like high school rivalries, because the rival high school of my high school was named Cillian. And God, I hated Cillian.
Really? Oh no, I'm so sorry. Was it Cillian with a C or Cillian with a K?
With a K. So like, let's distinguish Cillian with a K. No shout out to Cillian High School. They're trash.
But if it was Cillian with a C, you'd give it a shout out. You would do.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.
Here's what it makes me think of. It makes me think of the movie The Running Man, which is a great 80s movie, and Cillian is the bad guy who's the host of the show.
That's right.
Oh, I'll take any of those references. They all feel reasonable.
It was one of the first Arnold moves where he turns to the camera and says, "Cillian, I'll be back." It was one of the classics for sure. Well, hey man, great to have you on here. Thanks for being with us. Let's first, I really want to first go into how much you like Back to the Future, because I've met you 2 or 3 years ago, and I did not know this until today. So tell me about it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, look, you said 80s themed, and I know the show, so I'm like, what would I pick? And of course, it dawned on me immediately, Back to the Future. And it's not a passing interest; it's quite obsessive. For those that know me personally, are aware of that. So, I remember watching the movie as a kid, quite literally in the 80s, and just it's sort of crystallizing. Like, I'm from Ireland, it crystallized sort of Americana culture at its best to me as like a naive Irishman, first of all, right? It looked visually beautiful, and like my passion's always been science, right? Like that's what I studied, that's what I care for. And so it was just crazy scientists, time machine, and my family is obsessed with cars and motorcycles. So it just had everything that I would aspire to in life, basically. Yeah.
It's one of my favorite movies. As a kid, for sure, I was obsessed with it. Now as an adult, I'm like, feel like Marty McFly has a really strange relationship as a high school student with like an old creepo. But yeah, like
admittedly, when you get into the plot, like it's weird.
it's
right?
kind of like a creepy like.
There's real tension between him and his high school mother, which is like also complicated.
There's really intense mom issues in the movie, but it is like when you're a kid, you're not receiving it that way, right? And like I was like, digging the movie, man. Remember his like pickup truck? It's like amazing,
Toyota Hilux.
The Toyota, yes,
beautiful
exactly. Thing, well, it was lifted. It was so nice. I love that movie, man. And I love cars and motorcycles too. So we're on the same page.
Well, what stands out about that movie to me, in addition to all the things you just mentioned, is the unfair shot at the Libyans that movie took. Also, like underappreciated how unfair that was.
Right, and it's such a both sensitive plot wise and time specific, right? It's shot in the 90s, it would have been some other part of the Middle East. Shot in the 2000s, again, it would have been different, but it was the Libyans back then. It was the Libyans, right?
Highly specific small country to really focus on. It felt really unfair to them. But I think it's a cool topic for us to talk about because, and I want to get into it with you about this, like. Clearly, the times we've interacted, the times we've talked, you mentioned time, but I would say, like, if someone were asking me about what I know of you, it would be like, yeah, he's really forward thinking. So, like, how did that, and that's Back to the Future. To me, that's like a lot. If you look at the whole franchise of all the movies, like the second one, they got really into the future. And so that was really cool to see. Like, did any of those things like sort of drive you to kind of want to be a creator or that type of thing?
God, it's such an interesting question, Andy, when you frame it like that. I think it would be very sort of hubristic of me to say back then when I watched in the 80s, it drove me to be a creator. I think the bit that I probably left out, which is a minor side, but slightly geeky thing. So I started coding very, very young. My mother exposed us to computers very, very early on. And so we learned to code as kids, but I got sort of quite seriously into it at about 12 or 13 years old. And I would stay awake all night long coding. First language of choice was C++, and it was obsessive for me. And my routine, this is going to sound like somewhere between a child and a complete weirdo, would be to get like a pint of milk and a pack of cookies at like midnight, and then sit and code with screen on, playing Back to the Future on repeat. And so I literally listened to it like a soundtrack while I would code. So it just exists for me quite literally as a soundtrack to everything I build. And so when you talk about creativity, I think the aspect of that matters to me is now maybe an entrepreneur or a product thinker, if you will, came later. Like in my teens, I spent a huge amount of time building things and making things. And that movie is just like a sort of soundtrack to those moments for me, if that makes sense.
When did you get to the moment when you went from building a thing or building a software thing to thinking to yourself, well, I got to build the whole company now, or I have to like do more than just kind of like, because obviously you, as a technical founder, you have a lot to do with the product itself, and that's your bent, you know, in doing that kind of thing. But like, how did you go from that to that?
I mean, I would love there to be like better founder mythology, because I know everyone's got these amazing backstories, but I think they fill in the blanks after the fact. I think if I was being entirely honest, I'm not going to say I fell into it. I dropped out of my college degree, physics and computer science, and my mother's still sad about that for what it's worth. Like, 20 years later, that's still the thing she's most upset about. And I worked as a contract software engineer for a very short period, and met a gentleman who would become my co-founder in my first business. And it wasn't that we sat down and said, we're going to build a company. He was an excellent, what you would now think of him against 18, 19 years ago. He was an excellent UI and interaction designer, sort of brilliant product thinker on the front end experience. And I was a pretty good software engineer who had, I think, a good product view of sort of end user empathy and end user use of a product. And we started making things. We basically said, well, the freelance customers we work with don't pay us enough. Let's start building things under a name. And we ran that business pretty successfully for about 13 years. It turned into one of the biggest sort of digital consulting shops in Ireland. Ultimately, we opened 5 offices across Europe and the US. And so there wasn't a moment where I sat down and said, I'm going to own a company. It was more, I will build products that solve problems. And that proliferated into a business, I think, in the first instance.
Awesome. I think it doesn't have to be mythological, it just is what it is for anybody. I
For
mean,
sure. For sure.
so how did uh, other than your brother being a privacy lawyer, which is probably not the way this happened, but like how did privacy become the tech that you were gonna be focused on and you were gonna think about and build? He made the dumber choice, by the way,
For sure.
to go to law school.
I mean, well, I mean, I definitely, when I look at the hours that you folks put in both at school and then in the first few years, like in firms, I don't know how you do it. That's besides the point. I have huge admiration for your tenacity.
We destroy components of our souls.
I believe that. I believe that. I'll never forget the first time he and a group of associates at the firm you were at were telling me with pride how many magic roundabouts they'd done in a row. I didn't even know what the expression meant. And I was told that it was where you go home, have a shower, get changed, and go back to the office without stopping. That just blew my mind. That was a point of pride. Anyway, so the genesis for what became Ethica is actually from my earlier business. So, that business was working with large enterprise customers, so legacy and large household brands, consumer packaged goods businesses like Heineken and Pepsi and Unilever, et cetera. And our as a sort of vendor to those businesses, our first exposure to the GDPR at the time was sort of 7-8 years ago, and it was fascinating. It was I won't name the company, but it's this chief legal officer of one of those very large brands. So he came into a room with a bunch of vendors, technology vendors in the room to that business, and basically said, "Hey, the GDPR is coming. The GDPR is coming." Sort of like their head on fire. I had no context for what the GDPR was at the time. We weren't asked to solve it for that company. We were asked to ensure that our business would be ready for this future state of compliance. Right? That was how it was framed to us, along with a bunch of other vendors. And of course, all engineers and data folks thinking about the problem, you go away and look at the regulatory requirements. This is again 4.5-5 years before the GDPR comes into effect. And you find that the solution essentially is to hire management consultants at the time, right? It's like you hire management consultants, they'll interview engineers, they'll analyze schema, they'll effectively evaluate the risk of things in the business and potentially provide you with sort of remediative actions. What I and the team I was working with couldn't wrap our head around was the regulations to us, very naively as non-lawyers and thinking from a product and engineering perspective, the regulations seemed to be intended very well to essentially define to a certain degree what I didn't know at the time was the principles of privacy by design. Like, how do you enforce those in a system? So not just how do you add people to a process, but how do you make technology behave better with the data it collects and how it uses that information. So I found it curious that what we were doing was throwing a lot of human capital at the problem, like more and more human beings evaluating the risk of systems. This seemed like an engineering problem that needed to be managed by lawyers, and that was strange to me. And so the sort of thesis for Ethica was formed from there. And I think what I was more surprised by was that the tech world was late to this problem, because I think, as you'll all recognize, like the venture-backed tech community has a different attitude to compliance or regulation. Like, you traditionally take the Uber model, like you bend it to your will, right? Like you can bend compliance until it sort of fits the operating model of the business. And the sort of view that I would take, of course, and is that, and obviously businesses like that have been very successful. The view we would take is actually business needs to think long and hard about risk in the products they create. But the problem for engineers is the tools don't exist to do that. So Ethica ultimately established itself to provide tools to engineers to make better products, right? Safer, more respectful products.
We went through this a lot, like when the GDPR, like maybe the year before, when we were kind of starting to think it through, and like from an ad tech perspective, think through like what's going to happen to cookies and consent and things like that. And the feedback we got when we had discussions internally or back channel got like regulator feedback was like, the tech community is going to have to figure this out. Like, you're going to have to evolve and figure this out. And I find it interesting that you kind of saw it that way right away. Like the tech is going to have to jump in here. And all these, and this is like where your experience with all these brands over 13 years makes sense to me. Like, you had a exposure to all the ways in which enterprises have fucked up systems, in the sense that they're just like built 50 systems plugged together in a way that for a large enterprise only they can sort of diagnose and figure out. And the challenge you sort of decided to take on was, let's give developers tools to like help them figure that out.
Right, exactly. Like, and you guys know this better than anybody because you sit in that function in those organizations. the larger a business it's not, first of all, we all know that privacy isn't just beholden to large businesses. This is the responsibility of every business that wants to behave ethically, right? And it becomes to a certain degree table stakes for like brand and trust. But then, a business that starts small, like let's assume this sort of trope of like two engineers in a room come up with an idea and they build a thing quickly. The issue is that idea of agility, that like move fast and break things message that sounds great, becomes the sword you fall on in the future, right? Because you are moving so quickly, you're not necessarily putting in the sort of consideration to how that product will behave at scale with a lot of data or a lot of other users or engineers on the business side. And then it becomes very hard to fix that, right? So then you've already, like the horse is bolted, right? The product's in production, it's in the real world, it's accumulating user data, you're growing successfully, all of that's awesome. You're bolting on additional distributed systems and vendors to accumulate and manage that data and sort of leverage it in a positive sense. But now you can't put that back in the box. And so now you end up with the sort of outcome of using products like the ones we see in the sort of current privacy GRC space, which are effectively tools intended to sort of stem risk after it's already occurred, right? Like the product's in production, we now have a problem, tell us where our data is. And that's where you get into data discovery and data mapping, right? You could argue that problem shouldn't exist if the design of systems beforehand is better, right?
Well, is it about better design or is it about the slow trail of regulation? Right? Because
yeah,
I mean, that's to me is the biggest, no question about, like the lack of, let me say it a different way. GDPR didn't exist when a lot of these companies built themselves.
Totally,
right?
totally
And
fair.
so like,
totally fair.
Right? So like, I think sometimes, and I'm literally not speaking as a Facebooker, but just in general, like, I think it's difficult to say to like the top 5 or 6 or the top 100 tech companies, well, you got it all wrong. Well, I don't know about that, right?
I'd agree, 100% agree with you, Pedro. They didn't, because they built around the constraints they knew existed, right?
Then we're there, yeah.
Totally. The example we used to rationalize our business 2.5 years ago when we were talking to investors about the sea change we saw coming, the way we framed it was PCI compliance, PCI DSS compliance as it related to payment processing. In the early 2000s, right, you could do anything with a credit card. I don't mean intentionally, I just mean there were no regulations. I'm oversimplifying, but you could process a credit card without encrypted transactions, right? There was no mandatory requirements for TLS. And it doesn't mean engineers intentionally did that out of like a lack of care. It just wasn't a requirement. Those business requirements didn't exist. So they did it the best they could. Then you have an inflection point at which fraud rises so much you get PCI DSS mandated in the industry, at which point every business has to go back and reconsider how it builds payment processing gateways. And any small company that wants to process a payment has loads of friction to overcome to build a payment gateway. What Stripe does so elegantly at that point, and I think it's important to not negate this, it's not just they were a payment company. What they built was a very elegant compliance system. So you didn't have to worry about that as an end business. You could effectively borrow the knowledge that they had already accumulated to make you compliant with that. And I think what we see in our view of privacy, or maybe critical data management for trust, is that we've had the same issue occur now. The regulations now exist and are expanding and proliferating. The tools aren't there to prevent businesses from making those mistakes, you could say. And that's what's missing, is that layer of trust systems that ensures a business can continue to move really quickly and in an agile fashion without incurring that sort of late stage debt in 5 or 10 years time.
Was the pitch like, we want to be the Stripe of,
It's a name a bunch of our investors have used. We don't. I know I'm not like I try to avoid the like Stripe of data privacy, but it is, yeah.
I know, but it's kind of good. It's kind of a good fit, right? Because I think you see a lot of people use Stripe that way, and feel backstopped by that.
For sure, and it's worth considering that product roadmap, right? It started as basic credit card processing. I'm being harsh, but the early product, a decade on, it processes 20% of the world's credit card transactions, and it has a sort of ecosystem of products that support safe economic transactions. Privacy is the same, right? Like, and not its credit card processing, but it's a critical business asset for every organization that's data driven, and you need to adequately protect it and also provide trust to the end user. But those tools are only starting to emerge because privacy in the engineered sense is a very nascent thought, really, right?
Yeah, and I think Cillian's job, like the company's mission, is bigger because like credit card transactions are transactional in nature, right? Like they just repeat themselves. Like privacy compliance is definitely not linear that way, right? Like it's this like much more asymmetric problem inside a company, touches different parts of the business. and therefore a harder problem to solve, in my opinion. So yeah.
Totally. And that's why we, like, candidly, we take a very long view, like a decade-long view on the way we see this. So we state our vision as a business to be trust infrastructure. That sounds like a tacky cliche, but if you bear with me, the thinking is, if you really want to solve this in just the way you described, Pedro, it's a sort of endemic issue of data flowing around an organization over time. As it accumulates systems, maybe it acquires businesses. You can only solve that when you achieve a sort of critical mass of infrastructure. So every business is built on some of the same tools. So there's interoperability between data sets. You can understand what information each system has. And that sort of exists as an agreed standard. Until you get there, we will continuously be essentially like sort of unpacking balls of wool to try and find where data is. That never goes away. So it has to become a sort of infrastructure solution.
When we had a conversation with our friend Vivek, who runs privacy at Shopify, we did the movie The Three Amigos, and we talked about the bad guy was El Guapo. And I think and we were talking about what are the big privacy El Guapos, and we had a great conversation about, like, you know, what that means for us as lawyers. And I'm curious from you as a founder CEO, what do you see as the biffs, you know, the big biff, bad things, or not bad, like, you know, kind of the challenges that you're going to see.
Headwinds.
Over headwinds, yeah.
I think, you know, the obvious one, which you guys have both experienced, and I say this as the software engineer, is a sort of cultural dissonance between the legal GRC and the engineering function of the organization, right? So you both want the same thing, right? Like in a different way, in that, you know, the legal entity or the privacy council function wants to mitigate risk for the organization, do the right thing from a sort of cultural and trust perspective for its users, that respect and ethics. Engineers, I believe, are intrinsically ethical, but everything that's being provided to them today in terms of process feels like friction. Like it's, hey, fill in these forms. Hey, let's go through a PIA process. Let's make that part of the SDLC. Let's evaluate risk, speak to these auditors, et cetera. And so the dissonance right now is that their objectives are set against sort of agility, continuous integration, continuous delivery. And that doesn't align with the sort of slow and steady and measured pace. It isn't that they can't. Like DJ Patil has a lovely expression for this, right? Like a move thoughtfully and fix things, or move purposefully and fix things. It isn't to say that move fast and break things is bad. It's just we need to twist on that, because engineers have been trained so much that moving so quickly at the cost of everything else is fine, and we need better tools for them. So for me, the biggest concern is ensuring that engineers learn that this is part of their role and something they should be proud to do well. Like building respectful technology is something we should all feel pretty good about. Like, I don't think that's a bad thing, but the tools don't exist. So until they do, it's hard to blame engineers for that. That's my big one. That's the concern that keeps me awake.
There's only a few companies that are providing tools like this, and you have some competitors out there. Like, how do you see that landscape? We saw two big competitors of yours raise really large rounds, and
sure,
and that is, you know, both a benefit and a nail in their and sort of like a can be viewed as a strike against them in some ways. And so,
sure.
like, how do you think about that? You don't have to go into too much of your strategy
no.
or whatever, but just how do you look at that? I mean, I know you'll have thoughts on it.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to answer. But the companies you're referring to, happy to talk by name, right? OneTrust and Big ID, they've got slightly different theses themselves as businesses against each other and with us, right? I think OneTrust is born out of the slightly more traditional sort of GRC tool set and workflow and document management process that we're all, like, that the legal function's familiar with. It was first to market, very good execution in terms of getting to market and getting to customers. I think where we'd all acknowledge, without criticizing, what the cracks show there is that it's an awesome workflow management, document management tool for the governance risk compliance side of the house. It doesn't actually mitigate risk in the delivery of a product. So it's great if you're trying to evaluate risk post hoc, like a product's already in the world. I want to have everybody fill in forms and evaluate sort of workflows. Big ID comes out the other way, which is, hey, you don't know where your data is. We'll tell you where it is, and then you can start to manage the risk around it. Our thesis is slightly different, right? It's sort of, as I alluded to, is those are problems that exist because the product is in market. Sort of, as Pedro said, it's anachronistic, right? Like, it's effectively, you didn't know the requirements existed, you put a product in the world, and then you got to go back and tweak it and add sort of privacy preserving behaviors and characteristics to it. That should be solved earlier in the delivery cycle so that it doesn't get to that point. You shouldn't need a big ID if your engineers have got the tools they need to generate data annotations or data maps, right? That's a problem that shouldn't exist. That should be easier to do. to get back to the point though, therefore, when I would say on the valuations, like kudos to them for raising, right? Like it's a frothy market. The secular trends are really compelling. Privacy is growing really quickly. I get it. Do I have a different thesis of how privacy gets solved in the long term and how you build better products, like actually safer products that mean that like legal teams like you guys sleep soundly at night because you're not worried that the product is going to just fall over or let data seep out? Yeah, that's not like, data mapping tools don't tell you what's going to go wrong. That's the wrong place to start. Right? You got to go back upstream. So
you got to do that much earlier to learn from those.
Yeah, I think there's space for an engineering focused privacy compliance tool. I don't think the other two really are that. They're good in their own right.
Very valuable.
Yeah, like I've used OneTrust tools, but I'm a lawyer sitting on the back end on the compliance side, and it makes perfect sense. I document risk, whatever. Totally. But like that's not the engineer's job, and nor is it productive for engineers to like look at some back end risk analysis. Like it's just I don't see how that drives in product development.
I agree. I mean, they play in the same space, but it's not the same tool by any stretch. And there's if one thing's clear, there's plenty of room.
It's about like you sort of said this yourself a moment ago, Andy, when you said, and Pedro, you did too, when you said it's bigger than just data privacy. The view we take is that data privacy is a critical issue in society today. You all know that. You're experts in this field far more than I am. It's worth calling out that the risk of data management, sort of the category of data that might be a concern for business, will vary. So end user or subject information or employee data might matter under some jurisdictions. But when you start to generalize and not care about privacy, you start to but it could be related to data, it could be HIPAA, it could be financial records. This is more about better design of effectively data management, data classification, data annotation systems. So that if you as a business, like you in the GRC function might say, well, the concern in our business is medical data, the concern in our business is end user data or employee data or a combination of those, you should be able to manage that appropriately. And so we think of this as a much bigger issue. This is the safety and trust of data-driven systems, like to know that they make the right decisions, that data ends up in the right place, and that you federate access to it appropriately.
Speaking of safety and trust, I've got to go save the internet here in a couple of minutes.
Just before we go, I do want you to talk about driving fast cars, because you have a fast car and a fast car behind you, but like.
That one travels through time, Andy.
Yeah, that's uniquely fast car.
Thank you.
I wish I owned that. Yeah.
But it only goes 88. So, how did your family get into this so much?
Yeah, look, I know we're going to type for time. So the quick version of this is, it's like cars and motorcycles have been in my family's blood. So my twin brother and I have been riding bikes since we were kids. My dad rode and raced bikes since he was a kid. In Ireland, there's a huge culture of, when I say street racing, what we call it is road racing. If you look up the Isle of Man TT, you'll see this.
I love that race.
Right, it's insane. It's literally guys on race bikes you would see on a track, but on closed roads. It's a legal race. It's very dangerous, but it is legal. It's just a very risky sport.
Have you done the TT?
Around that.
Have you done it?
No. I've attended and watched. But that type of racing, what we call closed road circuit racing in Ireland, is very common. They'll close some country roads and people will race. And so we've always been around bikes. So my brother races bikes. He's a racing instructor at the California Superbike School. So when he's not a Twitter, he teaches people to race motorcycles. And I build them in my spare time. I build motorcycles, vintage motorcycles.
We got to talk motorcycles, because I've been riding motorcycles since I was 4 years old. True story. And there's one right behind that wall. There's actually two about to be right behind that wall. I love to ride, and I like fast cars too. Huge Formula One guy, IndyCar guy.
Oh, Pedro, we've got so much to talk about.
I'm obsessed with Group B racing in the 80s. I know Andy has no idea what that is, but I know you do. I'm obsessed with Group B racing and MotoGP, like Marc Marquez, my brother from the Spanish homeland. So listen, I'm big into it too. I wish. We have and collect, my brother and I, old two-stroke MotoGP bikes, real two-stroke MotoGP, and we still ride them in the US. Yeah. I'm surprised. I'd be terrified, but like we need to do a whole other episode, and just talk cars and bikes. Just saying.
Cars and bikes. It's a separate topic.
Well, one of these days we'll actually have a drink in person.
I'm with it.
I hope so.
We didn't get to my great question of, is Guinness good? But we'll get to that another time.
Yes, of course it is.
It's okay.
Thanks for hanging out with us, man.
All right, thanks.
A pleasure, guys. Thank you
so
so much, guys. A pleasure. Take care. Cheers.
All right, you hang up and we'll do a little intro.
We'll do your intro and then you're golden.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks,
Cheers.
man.
Take care,
We're
guys.
talking
Bye.
bike soon. I love this.